Thank you so much for choosing to be with us during this hour, and welcome to our Meet VCU Authors book talk. My name is Christina Stange. I'm professor of English here and the director of the Humanities Research Center. And assisting me today for this great event are my wonderful colleagues, Ellie Musgrave and our assistant director, Hilary Levinson, who will also help me moderate part of the Q&A at the end. As you know, the HRC has many exciting events happening this spring, and you can find them on our website. Just to put two events on your radars, I hope you'll join us this Wednesday at noon for a virtual talk with Dr. Sarah Shear in our Curriculum Conversations series. Her talk is titled Destiny, Revisited Inclusions and Erasures of Indigeneity in the K through 12 U.S. History Standards 10 years later. And immediately following that talk, we'll gather in the conference room for our monthly lunch with Bob Gray, our Indigenous Elder in Residence, and we have the links that will be going into the chat box if you'd like to sign up, especially for the lunch portion. We also have a brand new annual report we'd like you to take a look at and advise us on other things you'd like to see here. Excuse me. Now, today's event is part of our Meet VCU Author series, which invites VCU colleagues, students, and community members to engage directly with our amazing VCU authors about their recent publications and the ideas behind them. Because of the continued success of this series, our audience now spans multiple states and several countries, and we have decided to keep this format virtual for now. So welcome to all of you joining us from near and far. These gatherings are also celebrations because scholarly books take years of research, writing, and revision. And today we celebrate that achievement. Our format for these talks, if you're new to Meet VCU Authors, our format is pretty self-evident. I'll introduce our guests briefly, who will speak for about 35-40 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for questions, and we'll address them in the order in which they are received. Please use the Q&A function or the chat function to post your questions. And we'll be recording this, so feel welcome to check out this talk later on our HRC YouTube channel. Now, it's truly my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Professor Brooke Newman. Brooke is Associate Professor of History here at VCU and one of our most dynamic scholars and teachers. Those of you who attended the CHS Elske VP Smith lecture in February saw her remarkable ability to command a large room and to translate complex archival histories into compelling public scholarship. Dr. Newman is a historian of early modern Britain and the British Atlantic, with particular expertise in the histories of slavery, abolition, empire, and the British royal family. She's the author of A Dark Inheritance, Blood, Race, and Sex in Colonial Jamaica, published by Yale University Press in 2018, which received the gold medal for world history in the Independent Publisher Book Awards, and was a finalist for the Frederick Douglass Book Prize, and also named an outstanding academic title by choice. She's also the co-editor of The Native Diasporas, Indigenous Identities, and Settler Colonialism in the Americas. Her research has been supported by distinguished institutions on both sides of the Atlantic, including McDowell, the Library Company of Philadelphia, the ACLES Center for American Studies at the British Library, the Omohundro Institute, and Georgian Papers Program, where she conducted research in the Royal Archives at Windsor Castle. Today's talk on Dr. Newman's newest book, The Crown Silence, The Hidden History of Slavery and the British Monarchy. I'm pretty sure I'm taking this wrong, but you have a wonderful picture of Brooke's book on your screen. This book draws on that extraordinary archival work to examine a subject of enormous contemporary resonance, the relationship between the British monarchy and slavery in the Americas, a history that has often been obscured, softened, or rendered silent. Dr. Newman's book has already been met with enormous praise in a wide range of venues, including The New Yorker and The Guardian. Please join me in congratulating Professor Newman and welcoming her to meet VCU authors today.
Hi, thanks so much, Christina, and thanks to all of you for joining me today. It's great to give a talk to VCU audiences and to others who are interested in the Humanities Research Center. So today I will be discussing my book, The Crown's Silence, The Hidden History of the British Monarchy and Slavery in the Americas. This book covers hundreds of years, and so this will necessarily be a bit of a whirlwind kind of snapshot tour of this book and what I do in this book. But I'd like to just situate us by beginning with a brief discussion of Britain's role in the transatlantic slave trade. Between 1662 and 1807, which was when the British abolished their transatlantic slave trade, British ships transported approximately 3.4 million Africans across the Atlantic and into slavery. Of those, about 2.6 million individuals actually survived the harrowing Middle Passage, which took many weeks, and the majority of them disembarked in the Caribbean, as these arrows indicate. Across all European empires, more than 12.5 million Africans were forced aboard slave ships, making the transatlantic slave trade the largest forced migration in human history. And this was a system that was not only commercial, it was also political. And in Britain, it began at the very top, which I'll be discussing today. Despite the scale and documentation of this history, the Crown has never formally acknowledged its foundational role in launching England into the transatlantic slave trade. Now, several years ago, in April 2023, Buckingham Palace did announce that King Charles, for the first time, supported research into the monarchy's slavery ties. This came about as a result of The Guardian conducting an investigation known as the Cost of the Crown. This investigation looked at the economic ties of the royal family, essentially the lack of transparency involving the royal family and their finances, as well as the historic links between the monarchy, colonialism, and slavery. I was one of the key advisors for the Cost of the Crown investigation, looking into the slavery ties. And although there's, many different things I could have given The Guardian, what I ultimately shared with The Guardian is this manuscript image that you see on your screen. And what it shows is the transfer of 1,000 pounds of Royal African Company stock to the incoming king and governor, King William III, in early 1689. And so the company essentially gives this incoming king 1,000 pounds of stock shares in exchange for him being willing to serve as governor. Who ends up making this transfer is Colston, Edward Colston, whose statue was thrown into the river by Bristol protesters. And so this was a powerful image to share because Colston had been in the news. People had been protesting Colston, and also many different protests had occurred since 2020 and the Black Lives Matter movement. So this was a powerful moment of reckoning for the British government, but particularly for the Crown. And one of the things that I think is important to note is that in addition to the king being willing to make this statement that he, quote, supported research into these ties, there had also been mounting public controversy over the unaddressed legacies of empire and race. And these controversies had just sort of snowballed over the years. So, for example, as we all know, Harry and Meghan's bombshell accusations of racism within the royal family, interview with Oprah, and essentially exit from their official royal duties. Barbados removing Queen Elizabeth as head of state in November 2021. And also discussing that one of the reasons they were breaking ties formally and finally with the UK was because of this unaddressed history and legacy of colonialism and slavery. And then, as well, we have Will and Kate's disastrous Caribbean tour in 2022, which drew protests and heavy scrutiny. It was seen as tone deaf. And then in 2023, the announcement by church commissioners, which is what you see in the center of the screen here, of the establishment of a £100 million fund to address the Church of England's historical investments linked to slavery. So this happened in this larger context of mounting controversy and momentum. That is what led to this announcement that the king was interested in addressing these links. But I think it's really important to emphasize that the king's announcement in many ways was a sort of smoke and mirrors moment because historians have had access to the royal collection and the royal archives, which are housed in the Round Tower of Windsor Castle for decades. We have long had access to these records, even if it is a bit challenging to work in Windsor Castle. You have to get a security clearance. It's a bit irritating. I could talk more about some of that during Q&A if you're interested. But this idea that the king alone holds the key was just simply not true. And I think the other thing that's really significant about this statement is that the royal collections alone, which is a heavily curated collection, cannot fully reconstruct the monarchy's role in slavery. In fact, to uncover these links depends not on a single archive, but on reconstructing networks of power and profit across a wider imperial record. So this is a much more elaborate process than this moment in 2023 made it seem. What historians must grapple with are archival silences. And this is something that historians, no matter what field they specialize in, have to deal with. We are in many ways constrained by the surviving evidence. History is based on historical evidence, but this is a problem that is especially acute for those of us who work on the history of slavery. This is an archive that is fragmentary and it is designed intentionally to obscure human beings and reduce them to commodities in ledgers, in cargo manifests, in balance sheets, even in correspondence. And then even seemingly benign images like this 18th century Jamaican pastoral scene, which you see on the screen, they are also designed to sanitize plantation life, to mask the brutality of slavery, which is just beyond the frame. So reading the archive of slavery requires historians to not only recover, what survives, but also to critically interpret what was omitted, deliberately erased, or silenced. And in this case, we also have to grapple with the fact that it is the humanity of our subjects that has been deliberately erased in this archive. So on that note, I'm going to begin with the Tudor origins of England's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. To understand why Queen Elizabeth I supported English slaving ventures in the 1560s, it's essential to situate her policies within the geopolitical rivalry, economic constraints, and religious ideology of the Tudor era. In the book, I do this at great length. Right now, this is just going to be a really brief overview. By the late 15th century, Spain and Portugal had established a near monopoly over Atlantic exploration and overseas empire. Their claims were formalized by papal authority and agreements such as the Treaty of Tordesillas, which divided the non-European world between these Iberian powers on the premise that Christian rulers could claim lands, quote, not previously possessed by any Christian owner, end quote. Papal decrees fused religious expansion with imperial extraction, legitimizing in the process the conversion of non-Christian populations, whether willingly or by force, the seizure of territory and erasure of indigenous sovereignty, the exploitation of mineral, agricultural, and human resources. England, by contrast, during this period, lacked the fiscal infrastructure and naval capacity to directly challenge Iberian dominance. However, by the mid-16th century, English merchants began pursuing indirect strategies to penetrate these Iberian-controlled Atlantic markets. And they did this through privateering, through contraband trade, and through experimental slaving voyages that operated at the margins of Iberian imperial systems. Under Protestant Queen Elizabeth I, who came to the throne in 1558, opportunistic attempts to break into these Iberian commercial monopolies in the Atlantic accelerated. And this is also where the religious aspects of this come in, because Elizabeth is a Protestant and she is also interested in potentially profiting from expanding the English Empire abroad, but also just breaking into these Iberian Catholic commercial overseas networks. The Queen promoted multiple so-called Guinea ventures, loaning vessels from her modest royal navy, which she had inherited, to merchant syndicates in exchange for a share of the profits to benefit her cash-strapped government. So most of these early English ventures to West Africa were focusing on commodities that were already in demand in Europe and would command a high price. Things like gold, ivory, and pepper, and rare woods used to make red dye. That changed in 1563 after the Plymouth merchant John Hawkins returned from his first successful transatlantic illicit slaving venture. Hawkins had sailed to Sierra Leone and, as he later claimed, quote, got into his possession, partly by the sword and partly by other means, around 300 African individuals. After he crossed the Atlantic, he sold the survivors to Spanish colonists and Hispaniola in exchange for animal hides, ginger, pearls, and sugar. When he returned to England, word spread of his success. The Queen heard about this slaving venture and all of the profit that Hawkins had generated through this venture. So in 1564, she offered to sponsor his next slaving voyage by lending him a 700-ton warship, the Jesus of Lubeck. The tonnage of this one ship was more than 2.5 times that of Hawkins' entire fleet of 3 ships. So this was an absolutely enormous ship. Sailing in the Jesus and flying the Royal Standard would give Hawkins prestige, but also it would enable him to claim that he acted under the command of the Queen of England. When he returned from his second slaving voyage in 1565, after transporting around 400 African men, women, and children across the Atlantic to Spanish America, Hawkins and his sponsors, including the Queen, made a total of 66,000 pounds, which in today's US dollars is around $60 million. So this was not only a staggering 60% return on their investment, it demonstrated the enormous profits to be made through slaving, but also breaking into the Spanish Americas and into this closed commercial system. In October 1567, Hawkins set out on his third slaving venture, after promising the Queen immense profit in gold and jewels if she reinvested. And I think it's really important to note that in the surviving manuscript correspondence, he makes it extremely explicit what he intends to do, that this is not just a simple trading mission, that this is a slaving voyage that the Queen is investing in. This time, she loaned him 2 royal warships, and his expedition at the time totaled 6 ships and 408 men, making it the largest English slaving venture of the entire 16th century. But this third voyage, from their perspective, ended disastrously, with the loss of half of his ships and 3/4 of his crew. This was due to a conflict with the Spanish fleet at Veracruz, which was the principal port of New Spain. This episode deepened Anglo-Spanish tensions and outraged King Philip II of Spain, who did not want the English profiting from his empire in the Americas, and he did not want English, as he saw them, pirates, coming to trade with his subjects in the Americas and in any way making money through slaving or any other type of commercial enterprise. Spain rejected Hawkins' demands for legal redress, and Hawkins had also claimed 28,000 pounds in compensation for the loss of his goods to the Spanish fleet. This was rejected out of hand by the king. Hawkins' claim for compensation included 57 enslaved Africans of, quote, the best stature, who Hawkins valued at 9,000 pounds, which is around 8 million US dollars today. At home, however, despite this loss, Hawkins was celebrated for his exploits. He was celebrated as a hero, and the Queen granted him a coat of arms featuring a nude and bound African, as you can see on the screen. So I'm going to now fast forward a bit to the 17th century Stuart era of expansion, which is really a very critical part of this story. The early Stuart period witnessed the rise of English piracy, colonization schemes in the Atlantic world, which resulted in Virginia, which some of us are in right now, and growing commercial engagement with West Africa. This begins initially under the reign of King James I, the first Stuart monarch. In 1618, James I granted a monopoly over all English trade with West Africa to the Guinea Company. This was a company set up by a bunch of enterprising merchants. By 1624, the company had erected an English trading fort on the Gold Coast in present-day Ghana. The company trafficked primarily in redwood, which was used in textile dyes, in ivory, hides, wax, and then gold, which was something that they were primarily interested in. They also, in their pursuit of gold, financed ambitious but ultimately unsuccessful hunts for gold mines that nearly bankrupted the company. So they were really hoping to just stumble upon riches that they could just claim without much effort. In 1631, Charles I renewed the Guinea Company's monopoly charter. By this point, English colonists in North America and the Caribbean were demanding laborers to sustain developing plantation economies. So the conditions had shifted. During the Tudor era, there were no English plantation colonies to transport enslaved people, which is why they essentially gave up on this effort after the loss of the Hawkins Third Fleet. But by the time we get to the 1630s, English planters are discovering that enslaved Africans could be purchased at relatively cheap rates and forced into hereditary bondage. This led to a demand for coerced labor that continued to surge. The Guinea Company tried to reorient itself and essentially break into the transatlantic slave trade in the 1630s and especially in the 1640s. But the company faced strong competition, especially from Dutch and independent traders. Slave trading and Atlantic expansion increased dramatically during the Commonwealth era under Oliver Cromwell. And what's fascinating to me as part of this larger story is that Oliver Cromwell is the one non-member of the royal family here that we're discussing, but he plays this pivotal role because he actively encourages overseas commerce and imperial competition. Cromwell worked with Parliament to dramatically expand the capacity of the English Navy to challenge Iberian and Dutch maritime power. He promoted the growth of overseas trading networks and chartered ventures. They passed the Navigation Acts to strengthen English shipping and to generate new customs revenue to support the government, and launched the ambitious Western design, targeting Spain's American empire. The Western design failed to achieve its primary objective, which was to conquer Hispaniola. But English forces did successfully seize Jamaica from Spain. Jamaica would become Britain's most valuable Atlantic colony in the 18th century, and its rapid expansion of sugar production would drive up the demand for enslaved labor. So Jamaica plays a really critical role in this larger story, as does Cromwell's decision to radically expand the Navy, the size and the strength of the English Navy, which the Restoration monarchs end up inheriting from Cromwell. So following the restoration of the Stuart monarchy in 1660, Charles II, who is the man that you see on the left, and his younger brother James, Duke of York, who's on the right, aggressively expanded England's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. And they're doing this within months of Charles returning to the throne. The king granted a monopoly charter over trade with West Africa to a company known as the Royal Adventurers. And early on, this company, like the Guinea Company, was kind of fantasizing about finding gold mines, but they very rapidly switched to investment in trafficking in people. And by 1663, they had prioritized the transatlantic slave trade above all else. And this was because the Stuarts realized that there were substantial profits to be made by capturing a larger share of the transatlantic slave trade, while simultaneously enlarging England's colonial labor force in the Caribbean and in North America. So they're profiting both through the expansion of a trade itself, but also from the expansion of coerced laborers in these plantation colonies, which will then bolster these economies and lead to further trade and greater customs revenue. The king invests in this company, as does his wife, Queen Catherine, the Queen Mother, his sister, James, Duke of York, their cousin, Prince Rupert, and other royals. They're subscribing large sums to this venture. The king also strengthened it materially by loaning vessels from the Royal Navy to the royal adventurers to get this trade up and running. The Restoration, as I argue in my book, marked a decisive shift. Royal patronage moved beyond sporadic experimentation to direct financial and institutional investment in England's emerging slave trading empire. And also, just to quickly say, on the left is the seal of the Royal Adventurers, and it features an elephant, which you will see again in some future imagery, as well as the ducal crest of James, Duke of York, who is the governor of the Royal Adventurers and the king's brother, and also the largest shareholder in this company. In the 1660s, the Royal Adventurers operated primarily along the Gold Coast, and they transported thousands of enslaved people to Barbados and Jamaica. Despite this early kind of flourishing of activity, the company faced financial difficulties that grew. This was due to a lack of liquid capital because they are trading primarily on credit, and due to war with the Dutch Republic. And so there's a number of different reasons why this company, despite actually transporting thousands of people, ultimately goes bust at the end of the 1660s. But by 1672, this company has been reconstituted, and Charles II grants a new charter to the Royal African Company, which benefited from the outset from direct royal support. Again, James, Duke of York, remained the governor of this company. He was its largest shareholder. He was its champion, publicly and behind the scenes. As Lord High Admiral, James, Duke of York, controlled the deployment of Royal Navy vessels, which he used to enforce the company's monopoly and to suppress independent competition. So he would actually make sure that the Navy is hunting down any independent traders who are acting outside of the monopoly. During the reigns of Charles II and James II, the monarchy enforced the Royal African Company's monopoly and tied slaving profits directly to the crown. The king issued proclamations limiting trade with West Africa exclusively to the Royal African Company and directed colonial governors to prosecute interlopers or independent traders. To signal royal authority and commercial legitimacy, coins that were minted from Royal African Company gold and silver featured an elephant, and this was the company's emblem. And what this emblem did was represent both the West African provenance of these coins, but also crown sponsorship. Gold guineas and silver crowns, half crowns, and shillings bearing the elephant or elephant and castle mark continued to circulate for decades. And this is just a sample of the coins that I found during my research. And what these coins did was embed the symbolism of royal backing into everyday commerce. Between 1672 and the early 1720s, the Royal African Company transported more than 150,000 enslaved Africans across the Atlantic into slavery, more than any other single company. Slave trading and coerced labor in the English plantation colonies generated substantial revenue for the monarchy. And this revenue, as I talk about in my book, was both personal in the sense that it's actually benefiting them on a personal level, as well as institutional institutional level. So some of the examples include things like stock dividends, which you see here. This is an example of a 330-pound dividend that was paid to to James Duke of York in 1676. And then also things like gifts of gold. James was given purses of gold, essentially to say from the company, thank you for your patronage, but also to secure his continued patronage of this company. So he's getting money because he's the largest investor in the company, but also because he's willing, as a member of the royal family and future king, to support this company and its interests. Additionally, he was so associated with this company that his initials DY for the Duke of York were literally branded onto the bodies of hundreds of enslaved people from children on up who were employed by the Royal African Company at its coastal factories. And these were known as, quote, castle slaves. So they're not branding everyone, they're only branding the enslaved people who are owned by the company itself with his initials. On an institutional level, far more lucrative was the customs revenue on colonial commodities that was produced by enslaved labor, notably sugar and tobacco. By the late 1860s, the revenues on sugar and tobacco comprised a third share of the crown's ordinary income. So this is money that is absolutely critical to the functioning of the monarchy, and that is clearly starting to underwrite the growth of Britain's fiscal state. But I think it's important to note that slavery is not only benefiting the monarchy on an institutional level or in a kind of minor sense on a personal level, it's also benefiting the ancestors of Britain's current royal family. In the late 17th century, Edward Porteous was a tobacco planter based in Gloucester, Virginia. He purchased enslaved Africans from the Royal African Company. He also purchased enslaved Africans from the Royal African Company and sold them to other tobacco planters and merchants. After his death in 1700, his estate, including an estate known as New Bottle Plantation and its enslaved force of laborers, passed to his son, Robert Porteous. In 1720, Robert Porteous sold the estate, including the enslaved people attached to it, and moved his entire family back to England. Later, a descendant, Francis Smith, married the aristocrat Claude Bowes-Lyon. Their granddaughter, as you can see on the screen, was Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, the future queen mother and wife of George VI, and the great-great-grandmother of Britain's current King Charles. So these links are institutional as well as personal between the monarchy and slavery. Royal patronage of the slave trade also shaped material culture and consumption practices in England. Slavery was increasingly visible and fashionable in elite circles. Enslaved African children appeared at court, but they were also featured in a kind of abstract way in aristocratic portraiture, standing in for these larger issues related to empire and slavery. Charles II's mistresses, in particular, commissioned portraits of themselves that included Black pages as status symbols. And all of these enslaved pages are wearing silver or pearl collars around their necks, so signaling their enslaved status. The imagery that you see here, and these are just a few examples, reinforced these women's social and political connections, also reinforced the whiteness of their skin, because this is an era when ideas about race are developing and overlapping with constructs related to gender and sexuality and empire. It's also very clear that these images were used to demonstrate that these women have connections to the monarchy and to King Charles specifically because of the exceptional presence of their enslaved attendants and because King Charles himself, his nickname was Black Boy. And this was in reference to his supposedly swarthy complexion and dark hair. The cultural association between the monarchy and England's transatlantic slave trade and the Atlantic slave empire continued after the Glorious Revolution in 1688 to 89 and the accession of William and Mary to the throne. And so this is after the Stuarts were driven out. And the Royal African Company lost its primary royal patron when James II was deposed due to his Catholicism and absolutist ambitions. But we know, as I mentioned earlier, that William III agreed to serve as the new governor in exchange for £1,000 of stock. William and Mary upheld the Stuart era practice of surrounding themselves with enslaved Black attendants, signaling the continuity of court culture and the ways that it overlapped with imperial interests and designs. In 2023, this bust of an enslaved man, which was commissioned by William III, was on display in the Queen's Gallery in Kensington Palace. However, the bust was mislabeled at the time as a, quote, favorite servant of the king. And I actually was with a Guardian journalist, and we asked the staff at Kensington Palace about this sign and why they had incorrectly labeled this bust. And they didn't really have an answer, and they ended up removing this bust from circulation and eventually fixing this signage, which I think was good. But this was in 2023, so I still am shocked that they had not at that point done anything about their display of this bust and the fact that it was featured in this room, which they described as a room of things that the Queen had collected and that she saw as her treasures. In 1698, Parliament ended the Royal African Company's monopoly, opening the slave trade to independent merchants. When the trade was opened, it triggered a dramatic upsurge in English slaving activity. And we can see this reflected in 18th century customs records, as well as in the volume of the transatlantic slave trade, which if you look on the slave voyages database online, you can look at the number of different ships and how much they increase in the 18th century after this opens up, and it's primarily independent traders that are driving this traffic. The increase is visible in the rising number of slaving vessels that are arriving in Jamaica and Barbados and the Leeward Islands, but also in places like the Chesapeake, which had been underserved by slaving vessels prior to the opening of the transatlantic slave trade. This also corresponded with a significant growth in sugar, tobacco, and other plantation-based agricultural output and subsequent customs revenue. And so this empire that is developing in the early 18th century is absolutely wrapped up in the expansion of the transatlantic slave trade, in the arrival of slaving vessels, and in the explosion of coerced labor in these different plantation colonies. In 1713, Queen Anne secured what was known as the Asiento Contract, and this contract granted Britain the right to deliver 4,800 enslaved Africans annually to Spanish America for 30 years. Access to Spanish markets at the time was seen as a potentially lucrative opportunity, not only for legal trade, but also for contraband trade. The Queen transferred the contract to the South Sea Company, a joint stock company founded in 1711 to manage Britain's immense national debt. And the idea was that holders of illiquid government debt could swap their holdings for South Sea Company shares. This would give investors direct stakes in the slave trade to Spanish America. Before she died, Queen Anne promised royal warships to initiate the Asiento, that she would give them to the South Sea Company stocked with supplies and men, just like her predecessors. She also invested personally in the South Sea Company, as did her Hanoverian successors, Kings George I and George II, both of whom also served as honorary governors of this slave trading company. The South Sea Company brand also suggests that slave trading retained its positive association with the monarchy into the 18th century. And this brand was used on enslaved people who were destined for Spanish America. This company, even though we think of it now as more of a Ponzi scheme, transported around 43,000 Africans from the Bight of Benin, the Gold Coast, West Central Africa, the Windward Coast, Senegambia, and East Africa to Spanish America. And they arrived in primarily one of two ways. Survivors either disembarked in Barbados or Jamaica, which is the South Sea Company's Caribbean bases. And when they disembarked there, first, they were doing this for so-called refreshment, as the South Sea Company described it. And what this included was inspection and then imprisonment in holding pens before they were then shipped to Spanish American ports. Or, as this illustration demonstrates, you'd have people who would sail directly to Spanish American ports. By the mid-18th century, Britain had built a vast Atlantic slave empire. Economic networks tied to slavery, including shipping, sugar refining, marine insurance, retail, banking, enrich major ports like Liverpool, Bristol, and London. The Caribbean sugar colonies were Britain's wealthiest Atlantic possessions, with enslaved Africans forming the majority of the population in these colonies. Yet, an empire reliant on a transatlantic slave trade, on coerced labor, was inherently vulnerable socially, politically, and economically. And this is what King George III would soon discover. When George III ascended the throne in 1760, he inherited not only a vast and expansive Atlantic slave empire, but also the racial ideologies underpinning this empire. As Prince of Wales, he may have questioned European justifications for enslaving Africans, as suggested by his notes in the Royal Archives, where he essentially was musing, before he became king, when he was Prince of Wales, in his notebook, essentially about how slavery wasn't really justified. But it's very clear based on his actions what his priorities were. He saw himself as a prudent monarch, as a monarch who was dedicated to imperial expansion and to maintaining his country's reputation on a global stage. He accepted slavery as a necessary evil throughout his reign. British victories in the Seven Years' War brought new territories in North America and the Caribbean and beyond for Britain. Imperial expansion increased the demand for enslaved labor, but it also increased the demand for enslaved people to serve in military roles on behalf of the king. The crown began to increasingly rely on enslaved men in combat and pioneering roles, and this is primarily in the later 18th century. And this culminates in the creation of the Black West India regiments commanded by white officers. Over 13,000 enslaved Africans were purchased for the West India regiments in the king's name at a total cost of £1,000,000, making the crown one of the world's largest purchasers of enslaved people. It's not until the late 18th century that there is a concerted effort to end the transatlantic slave trade. Abolitionists began challenging the slave trade, and these are abolitionists who are both white but also formerly enslaved Africans who are activists working on behalf of the abolitionist movement and with white abolitionists. Royal resistance, though, actually slowed progress of this movement. During the parliamentary debates, the Duke of Clarence, who you see pictured here, the third son of George III, and the future King William IV, allied publicly with the West Indian lobby. He was a member of the royal family who was openly pro-slavery. He defended the slave trade in the House of Lords. His pro-slavery speeches were printed and widely disseminated to help bolster this pro-slavery movement and sentiment. The West Indian lobby courted the Duke with lavish hospitality and expensive gifts, including a gold Jamaica service funded by the Jamaica Assembly, which is still held by the Royal Collection. Liverpool merchants also named slaving vessels the Duke of Clarence in his honor. So royal opposition, both public but also behind the scenes, helped to stall abolition legislation for nearly 2 decades. At the same time, even after the transatlantic slave trade was abolished, the lives of around 700,000 people who remained enslaved in the Caribbean specifically changed little after abolition. And this is what I think is a really important point to emphasize, that enslaved people by the 19th century were willing to take matters into their own hands. They were tired of waiting for action at the local or the imperial level. They staged rebellions in Barbados in 1816, in Demerara in 1823, and in Jamaica in 1831 through 32. Repeated enslaved resistance made it clear not only that Britain could lose its colonies in the Caribbean, like France had lost Saint-Domingue during the Haitian Revolution, but that enslaved people saw themselves as loyal subjects of the crown and that they demanded freedom and equality on their own terms, and they were tired of waiting. And I think this is the moment really when, in the 19th century, things start to shift and we enter this era of silences that we are still in now. And that really kicks off in the 1830s with Britain's Emancipation Act, which replaced the slave system with an apprenticeship system that lasted from 1834 to 1838. And this system was essentially slavery by another name because it required newly freed people above the age of 6 to continue to labor for their former enslavers without pay. Additionally, the British government compensated enslavers £20 million for the loss of their human property. And this was a debt that was not paid off by UK taxpayers until 2015. Meanwhile, enslaved people received nothing. Victoria's reign, which was long, was reframed or helped to reframe the monarchy and the expanding British Empire as something that was Christian, humanitarian, and liberal. In the words of one contemporary, under Victoria, Britain was ruled, quote, by the most humane sovereign that the world has ever witnessed on an earthly throne, end quote. In June 1840, Prince Albert captured this sentiment when he delivered the opening speech at the meeting of the Society for the Extinction of the Slave Trade in London. Before thousands of spectators eager to see the prince deliver his first public speech, Albert issued what I call the first royal statement of regret for slavery. He said, quote, I deeply regret that the benevolent and persevering exertions of England to abolish that atrocious traffic in human beings, at once the desolation of Africa and the blackest stain upon civilized Europe, have not as yet led to any satisfactory conclusion, end quote. Prince Albert did not apologize. Silence became policy. And that strategy persists to this day, whether it is a conservative government or a Labor government. PMs continue to make the same statements about how we should move forward, how we shouldn't look at the past. We shouldn't be thinking about the past or spending time on the past. And this also is very clear when you see some of the responses to my book by the more conservative elements of the British media. Historians and others who challenge this narrative with evidence are dismissed as shameful. But in my view, this past is shameful. It's necessary that we confront it. Additionally, I think there's plenty of shameful activities going on behind palace gates that don't involve historians in any way. The recent release of my book has renewed calls for the king to issue a formal apology for slavery. And there's more research, that will be coming out in the future, and more students also interested in this research. And so I think that this is a critical moment for King Charles to act. But what happens next rests with King Charles and with the British government. I think that the historical record, however, is clear. And as I argue in my book, the evidence of royal involvement in slavery is extensive, it's unambiguous, and it is impossible to ignore. Thank you.